The ad was 5 lines long. 5 lines in the classified section of the Yukon News, sandwiched between want ads for used furniture and employment notices, indistinguishable at a glance from the hundreds of other small postings that fill the back pages of regional newspapers across Canada every week. No photograph, no dramatic headline, no formal police appeal attached. Just 5 lines of plain text, written by a woman in Surrey, British Columbia, who had spent most of her adult life believing her mother was dead, who had grown up in a house where her mother's name was forbidden, where the silence around the question of what had happened to Lucy Ann Johnson had been enforced so completely and for so long that asking it had stopped feeling possible, and who had found, buried in old documents, a thread that led north. I am looking for my relatives. My grandparents' names are Margaret and Andrew Carville. My mother's name is Lucy Ann Carville. She was born October 14, 1935 in Skagway. A woman in Whitehorse read those words and picked up the telephone. Within weeks, one of the longest-running cold cases in Surrey-RCMP history was closed. Lucy Ann Johnson, 25 years old when she vanished from a North Surrey street in September 1991, 77 years old when RCMT officers confirmed she was alive and well in the Yukon Territory in July 2013, had been found. Not by a forensic breakthrough, not by a DNA match or a digital database or the institutional machinery of a cold case investigation. By a 5-line classified ad placed by a daughter who had been forbidden to speak her mother's name, who had spent decades in enforced silence, who had found a document pointing north and followed it. But the story does not begin with the advertisement. It begins with a yard being excavated, with a husband being questioned as a murder suspect, with a little girl watching investigators dig up the ground outside her family's house, while her father refused to explain where her mother had gone, and what had happened in the September of 1961 that had made her disappear from a street in North Surrey and never come back. 3 questions run through everything that follows. Who was Lucy Ann Johnson? Really? And what was she leaving behind when she walked away from Surrey in 1961 with her children still inside that house? How did a woman vanish so completely that her own husband was suspected of murdering her, that the family yard was excavated looking for her remains, that investigators spent decades comparing DNA samples against unidentified human remains without ever finding a match, when she was alive the entire time, raising a second family in the Yukon, living under a different name, existing in the ordinary visible world of Canadian daily life for 52 years? And how did a daughter who grew up forbidden to ask questions find, through old documents and a 5-line newspaper ad, the answer that an official investigation had failed to produce across half a century? None of those questions resolve without leaving something painful at the center of the answer. The reunion happened. Lucy was found. Linda Evans heard her mother's voice for the first time in 52 years. And yet the husband who had been suspected of murder, who had lived under that shadow, who had been interrogated and had his yard excavated, and had died in the late 1990s without ever being formally cleared, had spent the last decades of his life not knowing where his wife had gone or whether she was alive. The son Linda and Lucy had shared, Daniel, born 1955, had died in his late teens without ever seeing his mother again. The children Lucy had left behind had grown up in a house defined by silence and absence and the particular damage that an unexplained maternal disappearance inflicts on the children who remain. But to understand any of it, you have to go back to the beginning, to a woman born in one of the most remote corners of North America, to a marriage that the available evidence suggests was not what it appeared from the outside, and to a September morning in 1961 when Lucy Ann Johnson was seen by a neighbor on a North Surrey street and then seen by no one who knew her for 52 years. Lucy Ann Johnson was born Lucy Ann Carville on October 14, 1935 in Skagway, Alaska, a small port town at the northern tip of the Alaska Panhandle, the historic gateway to the Klondike Gold Rush, a place defined by the particular remoteness of the far northwest and by the First Nations communities that had existed in that landscape long before the gold rush had placed it on any map that outsiders consulted. She was of First Nations descent. She spent her earliest years in the communities of Bennett and Pennington before her family moved to Carcross in the Yukon Territory in 1943, when she was 7 years old. Carcross, a small community on the shores of Lake Bennett, surrounded by the mountains of the southern Yukon, would become the landscape of her childhood and early adolescence, the place that shaped her understanding of the world before the world outside it made its claims on her. In 1953, she left Carcross. She was 17 years old. She did not maintain close contact with her family after leaving, a detail that would become significant decades later when Linda Evans began searching for the thread that connected her mother's past to the present. In 1954, Lucy married Marvin Johnson in Blaine, Washington. She was 18 years old. The couple settled in the North Surrey area of British Columbia, Canada, in the residential streets of a working-class neighborhood that bore no resemblance to the mountains and lakes of the southern Yukon she had grown up in. They had two children, Linda, born 1954, Daniel, born 1955. Marvin worked as first mate on a tugboat. Lucy had contact with the Catholic Aid Society and worked at Vancouver's St. Paul's Hospital for a period. By 1961, Marvin was unemployed. The household that Linda and Daniel were growing up in was not, by the accounts that have surfaced across the years of investigation and retrospective reconstruction, a peaceful one. Marvin reportedly had a temper. He reportedly drank. The specific dynamics of what was happening inside that house in the months before Lucy's disappearance have never been fully disclosed in the public record. But the fact that investigators would later treat her disappearance as a homicide and name Marvin as their primary suspect suggests that those dynamics had not gone unnoticed by the people who subsequently had reason to examine them. In September 1961, a neighbor saw Lucy Ann Johnson near the 300 block of 145A Street in North Surrey. That was the last confirmed sighting. She was 25 years old. She left behind a 7-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son. She left behind a marriage and a house on a North Surrey street. She left behind everything that could be seen from outside the house and everything that could not. And she went north toward the landscape that had made her and that she had left 8 years earlier, and she did not contact anyone who had known her in Surrey for 52 years. Subscribe, like, comment, and share this video, because what Linda Evans found in those old documents, what the 5-line classified ad produced, and what the answer revealed about 52 years of silence in a house where a mother's name could not be spoken, is one of the most extraordinary cold case resolutions in Canadian history. Marvin Johnson did not report his wife missing until May 14, 1965, 3 years and 8 months after the neighbor's last sighting. 3 years and 8 months of Lucy's absence accumulating inside a household where 2 young children were growing up without their mother and without any explanation for where she had gone. 3 years and 8 months before Marvin walked into a police station and filed a missing persons report. An interval so long and so unexplained that investigators immediately identified it as significant. Why had he waited? That question would define the entire investigative direction for decades. A husband who does not report his wife missing for nearly 4 years after her last confirmed sighting is a husband who had either a reason not to report it or a reason to believe the report was unnecessary. Neither explanation was immediately available. Neither explanation was volunteered by Marvin Johnson in a form that satisfied investigators. Surrey RCMP treated the disappearance as a potential homicide from the beginning of the formal investigation. The 4-year reporting gap was one reason. The household circumstances were another. The accounts of Marvin's temper, his drinking, the specific texture of a marriage that a 25-year-old woman had apparently left without telling anyone, without taking her children, without making any contact with the family she had grown up with in the Yukon. A neighbor had mentioned something that sharpened the investigative focus considerably. The neighbor reported having seen Marvin dig what appeared to be a septic field in the backyard of the family property. In the context of a missing persons case already being treated as a possible homicide, that detail was not incidental. Investigators obtained the authority to excavate. They dug up the family yard looking for Lucy Ann Johnson's remains. Linda Evans was a child watching this happen. She was 7 or 8 years old when her mother disappeared. She had limited memories of her, playing in a park together, receiving a bicycle as a gift. The specific, fragmentary recollections that survive from very early childhood present enough to confirm that the person existed and was loved and was there, not detailed enough to build a complete picture from. When the investigators arrived and began excavating the backyard, she was a small child in a house where the adults were not explaining what was happening or why. She was old enough to understand that something was terribly wrong. She was not old enough to understand what. The excavation produced nothing, no remains, no evidence. The family yard yielded no confirmation of the theory that had prompted the digging. Marvin Johnson was interrogated. He was questioned about the 4-year delay in reporting. He was questioned about the marriage, about the household, about the circumstances of the last time he had seen Lucy. He answered, Investigators assessed his answers. Charges were considered and ultimately not laid. Insufficient evidence, the legal standard that stops investigations at the boundary between suspicion and proof. Marvin Johnson was never charged. He remarried. He raised Linda and Daniel in the house on the North Surrey Street, in a household where, Linda would later recall, her mother's name was not permitted to be spoken, not discussed, not remembered aloud, not placed into the ordinary conversational fabric of family life where a missing parent might otherwise exist as a presence, however painful. Forbidden. The silence around Lucy Ann Johnson was not the silence of grief finding no adequate language. It was an enforced silence, a rule, a prohibition issued by the man who had waited nearly 4 years to report her missing, and who had spent the years since living with the shadow of an investigation that had named him as a suspect, and then been unable to prove what it suspected. Daniel Johnson died in his late teens. He never saw his mother again. Linda Evans grew up. She carried the silence her father had imposed as the primary inheritance of her childhood. Not an answer, not even a workable theory, just the particular emptiness of a question that no one in her immediate world was willing to address. She grew into adulthood believing, as adults in her position almost inevitably do, that the most probable explanation for her mother's disappearance was the one the investigation had pointed toward from the beginning. Foul play, her father's involvement, a body that the excavation had failed to find, but that the absence of any other explanation made feel almost certain. She believed her mother was dead. She believed that for decades. And then, in the 2000s, she began searching. Not with official resources, not with the RCM support. Alone, with the internet and whatever documents she could locate, following the thread of a woman who had been born in Skagway and raised in Carcross, and had married in Blaine's Celt in Surrey, and had disappeared in September 1961, leaving behind 2 children and a husband who would not speak her name. She found a document, a marriage license. Her parents' marriage license, which contained information that the family's silence had never provided, the specific details of Lucy's family connections. The names of her parents, Margaret and Andrew Carvell, the thread that led north toward the Yukon territory where Lucy Ann Carvell had grown up, and where, Linda would eventually understand, she had gone back. The document pointed north. Linda Evans followed it. She had spent decades believing her mother was buried somewhere in that yard. Not as a vague possibility, not as one theory among several, as the working assumption of a life lived inside a silence so complete and so deliberately enforced that the absence of any alternative explanation had calcified, across years of accumulated grief, into something approaching certainty. Her father had forbidden the name. The investigators had excavated the ground. The case had been treated as a homicide from the moment it was formally opened, and Lucy Ann Johnson had not sent a letter, had not made a phone call, had not reached through the distance in any form that Linda had ever received. The silence felt like death. What changed in the 2000s was not the silence. The silence continued. What changed was Linda. She had reached the point that arrives for some adult children of the missing when the grief of not knowing has accumulated beyond what passive waiting can absorb. The only available response to the silence was to break it herself, not to accept it, not to allow it to remain the defining feature of a life shaped around an unanswered question since she was 7 years old. To go looking, to use whatever tools were available, to follow whatever thread she could find. She started with the internet. Online searches in the early 2000s were not what they would become. Databases were less complete. Digitization of historical records was still developing. The tools that make genealogical research navigable for ordinary people were not yet fully formed. But they were enough. Enough to locate in the fragmentary digital record of official documents beginning to surface online. Something that the family silence had never provided. A marriage license. Her parents' marriage license, Marvin Johnson and Lucy Ann Carvell, married in Blaine, Washington in April 1954, contained the specific details that the prohibition around her mother's name had made inaccessible across Linda's entire childhood and most of her adult life. The names of Lucy's parents, Margaret and Andrew Carvell, the thread that connected the woman who had disappeared from a North Surrey Street in September 1961 to the landscape she had come from. The Yukon Territory, the community of Carcross, the remote northwest Canadian wilderness where Lucy Ann Carvell had grown up before she was anyone's missing mother. Linda looked at the document and understood something. Her mother had roots in the north, deep roots, the kind of roots that a person who was running, not from investigators, not from a formal search, but from a life that had stopped being survivable, might reasonably run toward. The Yukon was not a random direction. It was the direction of origin. The direction of the family Lucy had left in 1953 and had not maintained close contact with afterward. The direction of the landscape that had shaped her before the marriage and the Surrey house had claimed her. The documents pointed north. Linda took that direction seriously. In June 2013, Surrey RCMP featured Lucy Ann Johnson in their Missing of the Month series, a cold case initiative designed to apply renewed public attention to the force's oldest unresolved investigations by highlighting them in media releases and local coverage. The feature named Lucy. It described the circumstances of her 1961 disappearance. It noted the 4-year gap before Marvin had reported her missing. It acknowledged that the case had been treated as a homicide and that the family yard had been excavated. It placed a photograph of Lucy Ann Johnson into the public domain. Linda Evans saw the feature. Something shifted. Not because the RCMP had provided new information. They had not. The feature confirmed what Linda already knew. But seeing her mother's name and photograph in a formal public appeal gave Linda's own private searching a new urgency and a new direction. The documents had pointed north. The RCMP feature had placed the search in the public domain. The combination was enough. She placed advertisements, not in Surrey papers, not in the lower mainland publications that reached the audience of people who had known the Johnson family in 1961. She placed them in newspapers in northern British Columbia and in the Yukon. In the geographic territory the documents had identified as the direction her mother had come from and the direction Linda increasingly believed she had gone back to. She placed a free classified advertisement in the Yukon News, 5 lines. I am looking for my relatives. My grandparents' names are Margaret and Andrew Carville. My mother's name is Lucy Ann Carville. She was born October 14, 1935 in Skagway. She included her email address. She waited. In Whitehorse, Yukon, a man named Howard was at work when he came across the classified section of a local paper. He read the 5 lines, he read the name, he read the birth date and the birthplace and the grandparents' names, and something about that specific constellation of details, a name and a date, and a place that belonged to someone he knew, registered as something other than coincidence. He called his sister. Her name was Rhonda. She lived in Whitehorse. She was the daughter of a woman named Lucy, a woman who had remarried after leaving a previous life in British Columbia, who had built a family in the Yukon Territory across the decades since the early 1960s, who had 4 children from her second marriage, and who had never, as far as Rhonda had known, been reported missing, or been the subject of a police investigation, or left behind children in Surrey who had spent their entire lives not knowing whether she was alive. Howard told Rhonda about the ad. Rhonda's first assumption was adoption. The woman who had placed the advertisement was clearly looking for her biological mother. Lucy must have given a child up for adoption years ago. Before Rhonda was born, before the Yukon life that Rhonda knew, in some earlier chapter of her mother's history that had not been disclosed to the family she had built in the north. She called her mother and told her what Howard had found. Lucy Ann Johnson, 77 years old, living in the Yukon Territory, known to her second family under a different name, listened to what her daughter was telling her. Then she said 3 words, I'm not missing. 3 words that collapsed 52 years of investigation, of homicide theory, of yard excavation, of DNA comparisons against unidentified remains, a daughter's lifetime of believing her mother was dead. 3 words spoken by a 77-year-old woman to her Yukon daughter in response to the news that someone in Surrey was looking for a missing person with her exact name and birth date and her parents' names. I'm not missing. She had never considered herself missing. She had left Surrey in September 1961. She had gone north. She had built a life, a second marriage, 4 more children, a community in the Yukon Territory, a daily existence that had accumulated across 5 decades into something complete and entirely her own. She had not filed paperwork. She had not contacted Marvin. She had left and she had not looked back, and she had not apparently known or considered that the departure she understood as a survival decision had been recorded in a police database as a homicide investigation with her husband named as the primary suspect. Rhonda contacted Surrey RCMP. The call arrived at Missing Persons Unit. Investigators spoke with Rhonda. They connected the dots, the classified ad, the Yukon daughter, the name and birth date that matched the file open since 1965. They made contact with the RCMP detachment in Whitehorse. Lucy Ann Johnson presented herself to officers in the north. They confirmed her identity. They confirmed she was alive. Corporal Bert Piquet, spokesman for Surrey Arkemp, described it simply. The stars aligned, he said. The timing was perfect. The investigator who had been working the Lucy Johnson file for several years, comparing DNA samples against unidentified remains, maintaining the file with the dedication that cold case investigators bring to cases that refuse to resolve, received the confirmation call on his second-to-last day working for the unit. He retired knowing the answer. Linda Evans received the news that her mother was alive. She was in her late 50s. She had been 7 years old the last time she had seen Lucy Ann Johnson. She had grown up in a house where the name was forbidden. She had spent decades believing the most probable explanation for the silence was that her father had killed her mother and hidden the evidence well enough to survive an excavation and a formal investigation. She had spent years searching alone. She had found the documents. She had placed the advertisement. She had waited. The telephone call came. Linda spoke to her mother. She later described the moment to CBC reporters with a directness that carries more emotional weight than any elaboration could add. I said, "I love you," and she said, "I love you." Subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. Because the truth behind why Lucy left, why she never reached back to her children, and what those 52 years actually look like from the inside is even more complicated than the investigation that spent half a century searching for her. Those 8 words, "I said I love you," and she said I love you, exchanged across 52 years of distance, across a gap that had begun with a woman leaving a North Surrey house in September 1961 and ended with a phone call between 2 women who were strangers and mother and daughter simultaneously, are the emotional center of this case. Not the investigation, not the excavation, not the classified ad or the Yukon documents or the missing of the month feature or the phone call from Rhonda or the ARC-CMP confirmation. 8 words. But between the phone call and any version of reunion lay a distance that love alone could not immediately close. Lucy was 77 years old. She was living in the Yukon. She had a second family, 4 children who had known her their entire lives as their mother and had not known, until Rhonda's call, that their mother had a previous life in Surrey, a first marriage, children she had left behind in 1961. Rhonda had assumed adoption. She had not assumed that her mother was a missing person in a cold case homicide file. She had not assumed that somewhere in British Columbia, a half-sister had spent decades believing their shared mother was buried in a backyard. The reunion that followed was described as tearful, real. The specific, undeniable reality of a mother and daughter who had last seen each other when one of them was 7 years old, now sitting across from each other as elderly women, trying to build something from what the years had left them. But the questions the reunion opened were not small. Why had Lucy left? What had been happening in that Surrey house in September 1961 that made leaving, without a word, without a goodbye to her children, without any contact across 52 years, feel like the only option? What had Marvin known, and when had he known it? And what did the 4-year gap between her disappearance and his police report actually mean? What had the house been like from the inside in the months and years before Lucy walked out of it and went north and never came back? Those questions did not have easy answers. Some of them had no public answers at all. And one of them, the question of what had happened to the man who had spent the final decades of his life under the shadow of a murder investigation, had an answer that arrived too late for the person it most needed to reach. Marvin Johnson had died in the late 1990s. He had died suspected. He had died without knowing where his wife had gone or whether she was alive. He had died as the man who had waited nearly 4 years to report his wife missing, who had been interrogated by investigators, who had watched them dig up his backyard, who had lived for decades under the particular weight of being the person a homicide investigation had named and never formally cleared. Then Lucy was found, and the RCMP released a statement that the investigation's resolution demanded, but that could not reach the man it was meant for. Marvin Johnson, the statement said, had been cleared of any suspicion in Lucy's disappearance. He had been dead for over a decade. Cleared, one word, issued in a press statement by Surrey Arkemp in July 2013, attached to the name of a man who had been dead for more than a decade. A man who had spent the final years of his life carrying the specific weight that belongs to people who are suspected of the worst thing a person can do and never formally exonerated. Not because the evidence had proven their guilt, but because the evidence had never produced the confirmation needed to close the question in either direction. Marvin Johnson had been cleared. He would never know it. That fact sits at the center of the Lucy Ann Johnson case like a stone that no amount of narrative arrangement can move into a comfortable position. Because Marvin's story, the story of a man who waited 4 years to report his wife missing, who was named as a suspect in her murder, who had his yard excavated by investigators looking for her remains, who remarried and raised his children and died in the late 1990s while the file stayed open, is not a simple story. It is not the story of an innocent man persecuted by an investigation that had no basis. The 4-year reporting gap was real. The household circumstances were real. The neighbor's account of the digging was real. The investigation that named Marvin as a person of interest had reasons for doing so that the public record supports. But Lucy had left voluntarily. She had gone north. She had built a second life. She had been alive in the Yukon Territory for every single year that Marvin Johnson had lived under the shadow of a homicide investigation. And Marvin had died, apparently without knowing what had happened to his wife, apparently without the closure that would have come from knowing she had simply left, apparently without the specific relief of understanding that the investigation had been looking in the wrong direction, not because of his guilt, but because of her silence. The clearance statement reached his family, not him. Linda Evans had grown up in a house defined by that investigation's shadow, by the excavation, by the forbidden name, by the silence her father had imposed around a question she was not permitted to ask. She had grown up in a household where the absence of Lucy Ann Johnson was present in every room and audible in every prohibition and visible in the specific way that a child can see the shape of a wound, even when the adults around her refuse to acknowledge that the wound exists. She had also grown up believing her father was probably responsible for her mother's death. Now she knew he was not. What that knowledge produced in Linda, the specific emotional recalibration of a lifetime of assumptions suddenly inverted, is something the public statements she gave in 2013 can sketch in outline but cannot fully access. She described the reunion with her mother as tearful. She described the phone call as the moment she said, "I love you," and her mother said, "I love you back." She described the discovery of the Yukon documents and the classified advertisement and the response from Rhonda with the matter-of-fact directness of a woman, recounting facts rather than processing them in real time. But beneath the factual account was a 50-year recalibration happening simultaneously on multiple levels. Her mother was alive. Her father had not killed her. Her brother Daniel had died in his late teens without ever seeing their mother again. And Lucy Ann Johnson had been living in the Yukon Territory, raising a second family, for every year of the 52 years that Linda had spent in the silence her father had imposed. The question that the reunion opened, the question that no press statement and no RCMP spokesperson and no tearful phone call could answer, was why. Why had Lucy left? The public record offers fragments. It offers the suggestion of a difficult marriage, Marvin's reported temper, his drinking, his unemployment by 1961. It offers the context of a 25-year-old First Nations woman in early 1960s British Columbia, married to a man whose household the available evidence describes in terms that imply it was not safe. It offers the specific geography of Lucy's origins, the Yukon, the community of Carcross, the landscape of her childhood that lay north of everything she had built in Surrey, and that represented, when the marriage had become what it had become, the only direction that felt survivable. But it does not offer Lucy's own account of what happened in September 1961. It does not offer her explanation for why she left without saying goodbye to her children. It does not offer her account of the 52 years that followed, of what she knew about the investigation, of whether she understood that Marvin had been named as a suspect, of whether she knew that Linda had spent decades believing she was dead, of what it meant to her to learn, at 77 years old, that a daughter she had left at 7 was still looking. Lucy Ann Johnson told Surrey Ark that she was never hiding. She said she was never missing. Beyond that, the details of her account, the specific explanation she gave for her 1961 departure and her subsequent silence, have not been fully disclosed in the public record. She did not give extensive media interviews. She has maintained a privacy around the specifics of her reasons that the available reporting has not penetrated. What is known is what she built on the other side of the leaving. After departing Surrey in September 1961, Lucy remained in British Columbia for approximately 2 decades. She remarried at some point during those years. She had 4 more children with her second husband. Children who grew up knowing her as their mother, without knowing she had 2 other children in Surrey, without knowing their mother was listed in a police database as a missing person. without knowing that somewhere in the lower mainland a daughter named Linda was growing up forbidden to speak her name. By approximately 1980, Lucy moved north. She settled in the Yukon Territory, the landscape of her childhood, the communities her family had inhabited, the geography that had shaped her before British Columbia and Marvin Johnson and the house on the North Surrey Street had claimed her. She was in her mid-40s. She had children. She had a life. She had returned after nearly 3 decades away to something that resembled the origin she had left in 1953. She had stayed. By 2013, when Rhonda called to tell her about the classified advertisement, she had been living in the Yukon for more than 30 years. She was 77 years old. She was embedded in a community and a family that had no visible connection to the missing persons file in Surrey. She had been, in every practical sense, a different person in a different place living a different life. Not because she had constructed a false identity or deliberately evaded investigators, but because she had left one life and built another, and the distance between the two had accumulated, year by year, into something that felt permanent. "I'm not missing," she had said. She had meant it completely. The reunion between Linda Evans and Lucy Ann Johnson happened in October 2013, approximately 3 months after the initial telephone contact. The CBC documented it in a brief report that described the encounter as tearful and emotional. The specific language of reunion coverage that acknowledges the weight of a moment without being able to fully convey it. Linda traveled to meet her mother. They sat across from each other. 2 women, one in her late 50s, one in her late 70s, who had last shared space when one of them was 7 years old and the other was 25, and September 1961 had not yet happened. What they said to each other in that room has not been publicly disclosed. What the people who witnessed it described was emotion that required no translation or explanation. The specific emotion that belongs to reunions that arrive after lifetimes of separation and that carry, alongside the joy of finding, the grief of everything the finding cannot restore. Daniel could not be there, Linda's brother, Lucy's son. Born 1955 in Surrey, he had been 6 years old when Lucy left. He had grown up in the same house as Linda under the same prohibition, inside the same enforced silence around the same forbidden name. He had lived and died without ever learning that his mother was alive in the Yukon. He had died in his late teens. The precise circumstances of his death have not been publicly detailed. Having never received the phone call, never heard the voice, never said "I love you" across 52 years of distance and received it back. He was not there for the reunion. He had never had the chance to search. He had never had the chance to find. He had never had the chance to place a 5-line advertisement in a northern newspaper and wait for someone to call. He had died inside the silence, and the answer that arrived in 2013 arrived for Linda and not for him. And nothing about the reunion could reach back into the years before his death and give him what it gave his sister. That is the wound that sits beneath the resolution. Not the investigation, not the homicide theory, not the posthumous clearance of a man who died suspected. The wound that sits beneath everything this case produced is the specific grief of a boy who grew up without his mother, who died without his mother, and for whom the truth arrived 20 years too late to matter in the way it needed to matter. Subscribe, like, comment, and share this video, because the questions this case leaves open are not about Lucy's survival, or Linda's search, or even Marvin's posthumous clearance. They are about what 52 years of silence costs the people living inside it. And the answer is not the same for everyone it touches. The public response to Lucy's discovery in 2013 was notably different in tone from the Sheila Fox reaction that would emerge a decade later in England. Some of that difference was cultural. The specific way that Canadian media covered a First Nations woman's disappearance and reappearance carried different assumptions and different emphases than British tabloid coverage of a white teenager from Coventry. Some of it was circumstantial. The details of Lucy's departure, the household she had left, the context of a 25-year-old woman in an apparently dangerous marriage in 1961 made the calculus of judgment more complicated for commentators who engaged with the case. But some of it was simply this: the image of a daughter who had spent her life believing her mother was dead, who had found an old document in an online archive, who had placed 5 lines in a Yukon newspaper, who had heard her mother's voice for the first time in 52 years and said "I love you" and received "I love you" back. That image was too human and too specific and too hard-won to easily accommodate the language of selfishness or cruelty that simpler disappearance narratives sometimes attract. Linda had done the work. Linda had found the thread. Linda had followed it north, and Lucy had been there, in the Yukon, in the landscape of her origins, in the community she had built from the decision she had made in September 1961, waiting, perhaps, in the specific way that people who have left something behind sometimes wait, not actively and not consciously, but with the particular readiness of someone who has never fully stopped being findable. She said she was never hiding. She said she was never missing. What she had been for 52 years was north, and Linda had found the document that pointed there, and a 5-line classified advertisement had done the rest. But the questions that the reunion could not answer, the questions about what Lucy knew and when she knew it, and what she understood about the investigation that had named her husband as a murderer and excavated his yard looking for her body, were still open. And the question of what the 52 years had looked like from inside Lucy's experience, from the perspective of a woman who had left a dangerous situation and gone north and built something new and called herself not missing, was the question that everything else in this case had been building toward. It deserved its full answer. She said she was never hiding. She said she was never missing. And if you hold those two statements alongside everything the investigation had concluded across 52 years, theory, the excavated yard, the DNA comparisons against unidentified remains, the suspect who died without being cleared, the gap between what Lucy understood about her own departure and what the people she left behind understood about it becomes one of the most psychologically complex spaces in the entire case. She was not wrong. She had left. She had gone north. She had built a life. She had not filed paperwork notifying Suri of her continued existence, but no law required her to. She had not contacted Marvin, but the circumstances of the marriage she was leaving, the temper, the drinking, the unemployment, the specific texture of a household that a 25-year-old First Nations woman in 1961 British Columbia had determined she could not stay inside, made the silence around her departure something other than casual indifference. She had not hidden. She had simply gone in a direction that the investigation never thought to look, and stayed there, and lived. And she was not wrong about any of that. But Linda was not wrong either. And Daniel was not wrong. Daniel, who had died in his late teens inside the enforced silence of a house where his mother's name could not be spoken, who had never received any of what the July 2013 phone call gave his sister, who had grown up carrying the specific damage that an unexplained maternal absence inflicts on a child who is never given language to process it and never permitted to ask the questions that might have helped him begin. Two true things, occupying the same space, refusing to resolve into each other. That is what the Lucy Ann Johnson case ultimately is. Not a mystery in the conventional sense. The mystery was solved, the woman was found, the file was closed. Not a crime, though the investigation treated it as one for decades. Something harder to categorize. Something that sits in the space between survival and abandonment, between self-preservation and the cost of self-preservation paid by the people left behind, between a woman's right to leave a dangerous situation and the specific irreversible damage that leaving without contact across 52 years inflicted on the children who grew up in her absence. To understand why Lucy left the way she left, without a word, without a goodbye, without any contact across the decades that followed, you have to understand what she was leaving and what she was leaving it as. She was 25 years old in September 1961. She was a First Nations woman of Alaskan and Yukon heritage, raised in the remote communities of the far northwest, living in suburban Surrey, British Columbia, in a marriage that the available evidence describes in terms that are difficult to interpret as anything other than dangerous. Marvin reportedly had a temper. He reportedly drank. He was unemployed by 1961. He would wait nearly 4 years before reporting his wife missing, a decision that investigators immediately identified as suspicious and that remained, across the decades of the investigation, the single most difficult detail of the case to explain innocuously. What was happening inside that house in the months before September 1961? The public record does not fully say. The people who knew are either dead or have not spoken publicly about it. Lucy herself has maintained a privacy around the specific circumstances of her departure that the available reporting has not penetrated. But the pattern of the marriage, the temper, the alcohol, the financial instability, the specific dynamic that a 25-year-old woman with 2 small children had determined she could not remain inside, is legible enough in the fragments to suggest that leaving was not a casual decision made in a moment of restlessness. It was survival. And in 1961, in British Columbia, The options available to a First Nations woman leaving a dangerous marriage were not the options that would be available in a later era. There were no domestic violence shelters in the modern sense. There were no formal support systems designed to help women leave marriages safely and maintain contact with their children from a position of protection. The legal landscape around custody and divorce and the rights of women to leave and take their children with them was not what it has since become. The specific intersection of Lucy's First Nations heritage, her geographic isolation from her family of origin, her economic dependence within the marriage, and the institutional environment of 1961 British Columbia created a set of circumstances in which leaving quietly, leaving completely, leaving without creating a trail that could be followed, may have felt like the only form of leaving that was actually safe. She went north, back to the Yukon, back to the landscape of Carcross and the communities of her childhood, back to the territory that had shaped her before the marriage had claimed her. She was 25 years old. She had left 2 children behind. She had left them in the care of a man whose household she had determined she could not survive. And that specific detail, the leaving of children with the person she was leaving, is the part of her departure that resists the easiest forms of exoneration, and that the public record cannot fully explain from outside Lucy's perspective. Why did she not take Linda and Daniel with her? That question has never been publicly answered. It may never be publicly answered. The possibilities that the circumstances suggest: that taking the children was not safe, that taking the children would have created a trail, that the conditions of the departure made bringing 2 small children north an impossibility, that the alternative of leaving them was marginally less catastrophic than, are possibilities, not confirmed explanations. They are the shapes that the available evidence implies without the testimony required to confirm them. What is confirmed is what followed. Lucy went north, she stayed, she remarried, she had 4 more children. She built a community in the Yukon Territory across 30 years of daily life that accumulated into something real and permanent and entirely her own. She moved through the administrative systems of Canadian life: marriage records, children's births, the ordinary documentation of an existence being lived, under a name that searches conducted under Lucy Ann Johnson would not find. She was not hiding. The systems simply were not looking in the right place. And for 52 years, the right place was the Yukon. The institutional failure at the center of this case is not dramatic. It is not the product of corruption or deliberate negligence. It is the specific failure that belongs to an investigation that made a reasonable assumption: that a woman who disappeared leaving 2 children behind, whose husband waited 4 years to report her missing, whose yard was dug up looking for evidence, had probably been the victim of a crime, and pursued that assumption with thoroughness and dedication across decades, without ever questioning whether the assumption itself might be wrong. The Surrey RCMP investigated Marvin Johnson as the primary suspect in a homicide because the circumstances pointed in that direction, and because the alternative, that Lucy had simply left voluntarily without contact and had been living in Canada the entire time, generated questions about her absence from the children's lives that made it feel less probable than it turned out to be. The investigation was not irrational. It was a reasonable response to the information available. But it was wrong. And the cost of being wrong was paid not by the investigation, which closed its file in July 2013 with the confirmation that Lucy was alive, but by the people who had lived inside the investigation's wrongness across 52 years. By Marvin Johnson, who died suspected of a murder that had not occurred. By Daniel Johnson, who died in his late teens inside a silence that the truth could have broken and didn't. By Linda Evans, who spent most of her adult life believing her mother was dead and her father was responsible. By the 4 children Lucy had raised in the Yukon, who discovered in 2013 that their mother had a previous life, a previous marriage, previous children they had not known existed, that Rhonda was not an only daughter but a half-sister, that the family they had grown up understanding as complete was something different and more complicated than they had been allowed to know. Every one of those costs was real. Every one of them was irreversible. And none of them can be placed entirely at Lucy's door or entirely at the investigation's door or entirely anywhere without distorting the specific complexity of what this case actually was. If this story has reached something in you, if the image of a 7-year-old girl watching investigators excavate her backyard while her father forbade her to speak her mother's name, or the image of a 25-year-old First Nations woman going north in September 1961, with nothing but the direction of her origins and the determination to survive, or the image of Linda Evans placing 5 lines in a Yukon newspaper and waiting for an answer that arrived 52 years late. Subscribe, like, comment, and share this video, because this case is not finished asking its questions. And the questions it asks deserve more than a cold case closure notice and a press statement clearing a dead man's name. What does it mean to survive? Not in the abstract language of resilience and recovery that public narratives reach for when they want to make difficult things feel resolved. In the specific, daily, material sense of a woman who left a dangerous situation in 1961 with nothing and built something in the Yukon that lasted 52 years and contained a marriage and 4 children and a community and a life that she described, when asked, as not missing and never hiding. It means choosing the direction of survival over the direction of everything else. It means going north when north is the only direction that feels survivable. It means building something new from the materials available in the place you arrive at, without the resources that a safe departure would have provided, and without the support systems that a later era might have offered. It means living, daily, with the knowledge of what was left behind. And that knowledge is the part of Lucy's experience that the public record cannot access, and that only she can fully account for. She has not given that account publicly. She is now in her late 80s. She is alive. She is the woman born Lucy Ann Carville in Skagway, Alaska, on October 14, 1935, who grew up in Carcross and left in 1953 and married in 1954 and disappeared in 1961, and was found in 2013 and said 3 words that collapsed 52 years of investigation in a single sentence. I'm not missing. Linda Evans is in her late 60s. She is the daughter who was forbidden to speak a name, who found a document, who placed 5 lines in a newspaper, who said I love you and heard I love you back for the first time since she was 7 years old. She is also the sister of Daniel Johnson, who never got to place the advertisement, who never got to hear the voice, who grew up inside the same silence and carried it into a life that ended before the answer arrived. The Surrey Archamp file is closed. Marvin Johnson has been cleared. The investigator who worked the case for years received the confirmation on his second-to-last day before retirement and went home knowing the answer. The Yukon RCMP detachment that confirmed Lucy's identity has moved on to other files. The classified advertisement in the Yukon News has long since been removed from the listings section, replaced by other want ads for other things, leaving no trace of the 5 lines that broke open 52 years of silence. But the questions this case leaves open do not close with the file. What do we owe the children we bring into the world when the world we brought them into becomes impossible to stay in? What does survival look like when the act of surviving requires leaving, and leaving requires silence, and silence accumulates across decades into something the people left behind experience as abandonment, even when the person who left experienced it as the only available exit? What does a clearance statement mean when the man it clears is dead? What does a reunion mean when one of the children who needed it never lived to receive it? Those questions do not have answers that fit inside a press release or a cold case closure or a CBC report about a tearful reunion between elderly women who had not seen each other since one of them was 7. They have answers that live inside the experience of a woman who went north in September 1961 and said, 52 years later, that she was never missing. And inside the experience of a daughter who spent 52 years looking. And inside the experience of a brother who never got to look at all. The documents pointed north. Linda followed them. And at the end of the thread, in the Yukon Territory, in the landscape where Lucy Ann Carville had grown up before the world had made its other claims on her, was the answer that the investigation had been looking for in the wrong direction for half a century. She was there the whole time, not hiding, not missing, just north.